Picture the scene: a wild, windswept coast in Norway, where waves crash violently against the cliffs and the sky churns with dark, threatening clouds. It's 1867, and a local farmer, digging into a seemingly ordinary field, suddenly strikes something hard and unyielding, something that doesn't belong. As he clears away more earth, an astonishing shape begins to emerge: the elegant, sweeping curve of a wooden prow, intricately carved, unmistakably Viking. This is the moment the Gokstad ship burial was discovered, one of the most spectacular archaeological finds of the 19th century, pulling back the curtain on a world long shrouded in legend. But as magnificent as that discovery was, it was only the beginning, because Viking ship burials are far more than ancient tombs. They are time capsules, packed with secrets, sacrifices, and stories we are still struggling to fully understand. These magnificent vessels, often overflowing with treasures, weapons, and even the remains of noble warriors, were intended to carry the dead into the afterlife with honor and grandeur. Yet for every question these burials answer, a dozen more mysteries emerge. Why were some ships buried upright, as if ready to sail into the next world, while others were taken apart and carefully arranged like enormous puzzles? What compelled the Vikings to invest such staggering resources, entire ships, precious artifacts, and sometimes even sacrificed animals or humans, all to honor a single individual? And perhaps most haunting of all, who were these people deemed worthy of such extraordinary farewells? Join me as we set sail into the fog of history, exploring the most enigmatic Viking ship burial mysteries that continue to bewilder experts and ignite imaginations around the world. From the royal splendor of the Oseberg ship to the deliberately hidden, almost ghostly, Gokstad burial, we'll dig into the clues left behind and the puzzling gaps in our knowledge. You'll discover how modern technology is helping us see these ancient sites in entirely new ways, while also raising fresh, tantalizing questions. This is a journey into the heart of Viking belief, power, and identity, a voyage you won't want to miss. Just a few decades after the Gokstad find, another Norwegian farmer, this time in Vestfold, would make a discovery even more opulent and infinitely more puzzling. In 1904, a landowner named Oskar Ram embarked on a dig that would unveil the Oseberg ship, a vessel so stunningly preserved it seemed to defy the very passage of time. Unlike the warrior-focused Gokstad burial, Oseberg was a spectacle of artistry and wealth, its soaring spirals and gripping beast head posts representing the absolute pinnacle of Viking woodcraft. But the ship itself was merely the grandest container for a collection of grave goods that boggles the mind: ornate sledges, a richly decorated wagon, beds, tapestries, and even farming tools. This was a complete snapshot of a lavish, high-status life, buried with every conceivable comfort for the journey ahead. And at the heart of it all lay not a mighty king, but two women. The remains of two individuals were found in the burial chamber behind the mast, one aged around 80 and the other roughly 50. The elder woman was clearly the person of supreme importance, given the staggering investment of the burial. For over a century, the prevailing theory cast her as a powerful queen, perhaps even the infamous Queen Asa, the grandmother of Harald Fairhair, who according to sagas was a figure of immense political influence. The younger woman, then, was often seen as a loyal slave or servant, sacrificed to accompany her mistress into the afterlife, a grim practice attested in other Norse burials. But the objects buried with them tell a more complex and darker story. Among the exquisite items was a unique cart, covered in carvings that seemed to depict ritualistic scenes, and a so-called rattle, often interpreted as a magical staff. These are not typical items for a queen. They are the classic tools of a Valva, a Norse seeress. These women held a terrifying and revered position in Viking society. They were sorceresses, capable of seeing the future, chanting spells to sway the outcomes of battles, and traveling in a state of trance between the worlds of the living and the dead. They commanded fear and respect in equal measure, operating outside the normal structures of power, yet wielding immense influence over kings and commoners alike. So, who was the Oseberg woman? A sovereign ruler who held both political and religious authority? Or a feared sorceress whose power was so profound her followers sent her into the afterlife with a king's ransom? The answer may be both. In the Norse world, the lines between royalty and ritual were often blurred. A queen's power could easily be rooted in her perceived connection to the gods, and a Valva could accumulate wealth and status that rivaled any chieftain. The presence of seeds from henbane, a plant known for its potent hallucinogenic properties, near the older woman only deepens the mystery, suggesting possible ritual intoxication. Her identity remains the burial's greatest secret, a powerful reminder that our modern categories of royalty and religion may be too narrow to contain the complex realities of the Viking Age. While the Oseberg burial captivated with its artistic splendor and enigmatic women, the Gokstad ship, discovered just a few years earlier, presents a far more visceral picture of Viking power. Unearthed in 1880 on a farm in Sandefjord, Norway, this vessel was a beast of a ship nearly 24 meters long, built for both war and exploration, capable of riding the open ocean and carrying a crew of over 30 warriors. It was a statement of pure, formidable strength, and the man buried within it was clearly a chieftain of the highest order, a man who had earned his status through battle and leadership. His skeleton revealed a powerful, robust individual who had lived into his 40s or 50s, an advanced age for the time, and his body showed the marks of a hard life. He had suffered from severely injured knees and a significant wound to one leg, likely from a brutal battle axe or sword strike, injuries that would have left him with a pronounced limp, but had clearly not diminished his authority. The grave goods surrounding him were the arsenal of a legendary warrior and explorer. Unlike the domestic treasures of Oseberg, the Gokstad chieftain was buried with weapons, though they were tragically looted: 12 horses, 6 dogs, and even a peacock, a stunning exotic import that screamed of far-flung connections and immense wealth. Most importantly, he was buried with 3 smaller boats and a magnificent tent, equipment that paints a vivid picture of a man prepared to lead his men on a campaign anywhere, whether across the fjords or across the North Sea. This was a burial fit for a king, and many historians believe he may have been a member of the Ungling dynasty, the semi-legendary family that traced its lineage back to the god Freyr and eventually produced Harald Fairhair, the first king of a unified Norway. Yet his magnificent send-off was not his final chapter. Sometime in the ancient past, long after the burial mound was sealed, his tomb was violently violated. Grave robbers tunneled directly into the burial chamber, a deliberate and desperate act. They smashed the wooden structure to get at the riches inside, stealing the man's priceless swords and other weapons, the ultimate symbols of his status. In a final act of desecration, they scattered his bones and removed his skull, leaving it missing forever. This wasn't a random act of theft, it was a targeted, symbolic attack. The taking of the head was deeply significant in Norse culture, potentially an attempt to dishonor the chieftain, to prevent his spirit from resting, or perhaps even to harness his power for themselves. The violation of the Gokstad burial adds a dark, haunting coda to the story, reminding us that the reverence for these powerful figures was sometimes matched by a potent fear or bitter hatred that followed them even into the grave. But while the grandeur of Oseberg and Gokstad captures our imagination, the story of Viking ship burials truly begins with a far more fragmented and humble discovery. Decades before the spade struck the Gokstad mound, and over a century before the Oseberg queen was unearthed, the very first Viking ship ever to be excavated scientifically was found in 1867 on the island of Rolvsøy, near the village of Tun. This was a landmark moment in archaeology, the first tangible proof that the epic sagas of great sea kings and their vessels were rooted in historical fact. Yet the Tun ship presents us with a profoundly different kind of mystery, one not of opulence but of absence, a puzzle where the missing pieces are just as telling as the few that remain. Unlike the near-perfect preservation of its famous successors, the Tun ship was found in a sorry state. Its location in a wetter part of the field meant the wood had severely decayed, Only the bottom part of the hull survived, a ghostly outline of its former self. What the archaeologists of the time managed to recover were the essential clinker-built planks, overlapping and riveted together in the classic Nordic style, confirming this was indeed a seaworthy vessel, though significantly smaller than both Oseberg and Gokstad. The rush and limited techniques of that early excavation mean we are left with countless unanswered questions. Was the ship intentionally dismantled for the burial, its parts arranged with ritual purpose that we can no longer decipher? Or was it placed whole into the ground, only to be ravaged by time and an excavation that was, by modern standards, tragically hasty? This incomplete picture has forever locked away some of the tuned ship's greatest secrets. Yet, the clues that did survive are powerfully evocative. Within the remains of the ship, excavators found the skeleton of a single man, a high-status individual sent into the afterlife with a suite of grave goods that spoke to his identity. He was accompanied by the remains of 3 horses, loyal companions or powerful symbols of status meant for the journey ahead. Weapons were also present, including a sword and a shield, marking him as a warrior, a man of action and authority. But the scale of it all is what stands in such stark contrast to the later finds. His ship was smaller, his grave goods fewer. This wasn't the burial of a mythic, nation-founding king, but likely of a powerful local chieftain, a man whose influence was measured in control of a fjord and its surrounding lands, not an entire coastline. This raises a compelling question about the evolution of these burial practices. Was the tuned chieftain part of an earlier tradition, one where ship burials were more accessible to regional leaders before they became the exclusive, colossal projects of the ultra-elite later in the Viking Age? Or does his burial simply reflect the practical realities of his particular time and place, the available resources and local customs? The tuned ship forces us to confront the fact that Viking culture was not a monolith. Its traditions varied hugely across centuries and regions, and this first excavated ship is a critical, if broken, piece of that puzzle. It represents the foundational prototype, the initial expression of a profound belief that a great leader deserved a great vessel to carry them into the realm of the gods, a belief that would later be expressed on a mind-boggling, monumental scale. So the grand ship burials of Norway, from the mighty Gokstad to the mysterious Oseberg, paint a vivid picture of Viking Age power and belief. But this incredible tradition wasn't confined to the Norwegian fjords. Across the water in Denmark, on the island of Finn, lies a burial that is both uniquely spectacular and profoundly eerie, the Ladby ship. Discovered in 1934, it holds the singular distinction of being the only known Viking ship burial ever found in Denmark. And while it shares some similarities with its Norwegian cousins, the story it tells is entirely its own, marked by a chilling act of violence and a disappearance that echoes through the centuries. The ship itself was a stunning find, a warship nearly 22 meters long, designed for speed and power on the open sea. It was carefully placed in a trench and then covered by a massive mound, a permanent monument to the individual laid to rest within it. This was no haphazard grave. It was a calculated display of prestige and honor for a person of immense importance, a local chieftain who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. The grave goods buried with him were fitting for a man of his station. Exquisite riding gear, including a beautifully crafted bridle with ornate metal fittings, a collection of weapons, and even gaming pieces, suggesting a leader who valued strategy and entertainment. But it's what was found alongside these treasures that casts a long, dark shadow over the site. As archaeologists carefully excavated the ship, they made a grisly discovery. Arranged around the burial were the remains of 11 horses and at least 4 dogs. This in itself wasn't entirely unusual. Animals were common sacrifices in high-status Norse burials, companions for the journey to the afterlife. But the condition of these remains was horrifying. Each and every animal's skull had been brutally crushed. This was not a simple act of ritual killing. It was an explosion of extreme, deliberate violence. The force required to accomplish this suggests a ritual far more intense and terrifying than we commonly associate with Viking funerals. It speaks to a profound belief that merely sending the animals along wasn't enough. that their spirits, or their utility in the next world, required a specific, brutal method of dispatch. This paints a much darker picture of the ceremony that took place, one filled with loud, traumatic force, meant to absolutely ensure the chieftain had his entire retinue, living and dead, by his side for eternity. Yet, the greatest mystery of the Ladby burial lies not in what was present, but in what was conspicuously absent. When archaeologists reached the center of the ship, the place where the burial chamber should have been, they found nothing but a pile of rusted nails that had once held the wooden structure together. The chieftain himself was gone. His body had vanished without a trace. The evidence at the scene points to a deliberate, later intrusion. It seems that someone, long after the original burial, had dug a tunnel into the mound, located the chamber, and carefully removed the skeletal remains. This was no haphazard grave robbery. The valuable goods were left untouched. The target was specifically the body. This bizarre act of body snatching makes perfect sense when viewed through the lens of Denmark's dramatic history. Within a century or two of the Ladby chieftain's burial, Denmark underwent a massive cultural and religious revolution. It converted to Christianity. The new faith actively worked to stamp out the old pagan practices. And what could be a more powerful symbol of the old ways than a powerful chieftain buried with all his pagan glory in a giant mound? The theory is that later Christians, perhaps even the man's own descendants who had converted, opened the mound to retrieve the body. Their goal wasn't theft, but a posthumous baptism. By removing the chieftain from his pagan resting place and reburying him in consecrated Christian ground, they could, in their belief, save his soul from damnation. The Ladby ship, therefore, stands as a silent witness to this incredible moment of cultural upheaval, a pagan monument that was personally and directly confronted by the New World Order, leaving behind an empty ship and a mystery that endures. Yet for all the deliberate ceremony of Ladby and the grand mounds of Norway, nothing could prepare archaeologists for the discovery in Estonia that would shatter our very image of a Viking ship burial. In 2008, on the quiet island of Salme, workers digging for electrical cables stumbled upon something entirely unexpected. Not the carefully arranged grave of a single chieftain, but a scene of pure, unadulterated carnage. They had found the Salme ships, and the story they told was not one of honored transition to the afterlife, but of desperate, bloody conflict on a foreign shore. There were two vessels. The smaller one, Salme I, held the skeletons of 7 men, piled unceremoniously atop one another. The larger warship, Salme Roman II, was a mass grave for 34 more. In total, the remains of 41 warriors were crammed into these ships, which had been dragged ashore and hastily buried. This was not a respectful funeral, it was an emergency measure. The men had not died peacefully. Their bones told a horrific tale of close-quarters combat. They bore the marks of brutal violence, sword cuts to the head and collarbone, spear tips embedded in bone, and arrowheads lodged in spines. This was the aftermath of a pitched battle, a total massacre of a war band far from home. But who were these men? The artifacts buried with them, though hastily arranged, were astonishing. These were not lowly raiders. They carried pattern-welded swords of exceptional quality, the weapons of an elite warrior class. Intricately crafted silver-hilted swords spoke of immense wealth and status. Most tellingly, found among the tangled bones were gaming pieces made of whalebone and antler. These weren't just idle pastimes. In Viking culture, strategic board games like Hnefatafel were the province of commanders, men who planned tactics and exercised authority. These were high-ranking individuals, a brotherhood of the elite. The mystery only deepened with DNA and isotopic analysis. The testing revealed these men were not a random mix of locals. They were all genetically related, sharing close familial ties, and they had all grown up in the same specific region, central Sweden. This was a tightly knit warband, likely a royal retinue or even a group of brothers and cousins from a single powerful Swedish clan. They had sailed across the Baltic Sea, a formidable journey, only to meet a devastating end on an Estonian beach. The prevailing theory is that they were on a raid or perhaps a mission to exert political control over a key trade route. They may have been ambushed by local Estonian forces, who were known for their fierce resistance. The battle was so ferocious, and the Swedish losses so complete, that there was no one left to give them a proper burial. The survivors, if there were any, from the opposing side simply shoved the ships and the dead into a trench and covered them over, leaving this chilling time capsule for modern discovery. The Salme burial completely appends the traditional narrative. It shows us that ship burials weren't always planned, ceremonial send-offs. Sometimes, a vessel itself could become a coffin for an entire failed expedition. It provides the earliest and most gruesome evidence for organized Swedish Viking expansion across the Baltic, a dark prelude to the era of raiding that would soon descend on Europe. These weren't anonymous casualties of history. They were a band of high-born brothers cut down together, their story preserved not by sagas, but by the silent, skeletal evidence of their final, fatal voyage. Far to the west of the Baltic battlefields and the Danish plains, on the wind-blasted Orkney Islands of Scotland, a different kind of Viking mystery was waiting in the sand. In 1991, a fierce storm lashed the Bay of Scale on the island of Westray, violently eroding the coastline. As the tempest subsided, a local farmer named John Grote was walking along the scar, the exposed cliff edge, when he spotted something unusual poking out of the freshly disturbed earth. It was a row of rusted iron rivets, arranged in a distinct, graceful curve. He had stumbled upon the outline of a boat, and what lay within would become one of the most intimate and revealing windows into the lives of the first Norse settlers. This was not a great warship like Gokstad or Ladby, but a smaller, sturdier fishing vessel or faring, a type of boat used for everyday travel and work along the coast. It measured just over 7 meters long, large enough for a small crew but humble in comparison to the royal burials of Norway. Inside this boat, however, was a poignantly complete family unit, the remains of 3 individuals laid to rest together. There was a man in his 30s, a woman well into her 70s, and a child of about 10 or 11. Their ages alone tell a story of a long journey and a life of hardship. For the woman to have reached such an advanced age was a remarkable feat in the 9th century. The man was buried like a warrior, but not an extravagant one. He was accompanied by a formidable array of weapons that left no doubt about his identity: a sword with a beautifully decorated hilt, a fighting knife, a quiver containing a dozen arrows, and a set of whalebone gaming pieces. These were the tools of a Norseman, a man of status who was prepared to defend his claim and his family in a new land. The message was clear: he arrived as a Viking. But it is the treasures buried with the elderly woman that truly deepen the mystery and transform this burial from a simple grave into a powerful symbol of cultural fusion. Her most stunning artifact was a unique, exquisitely carved whalebone plaque. For decades, archaeologists have debated the purpose of these strange, handheld objects. Were they used for smoothing linen, as ritual markers in religious ceremonies, or as symbolic representations of the mirrors used by Viking seeresses? Whatever its function, it was a high-status object, a treasured heirloom that she brought with her on the long voyage from Scandinavia. But she was also buried with a simple, everyday Norse spindle whorl and a pair of shears, the universal tools of a woman managing a household. Then the plot thickens. Among these definitively Norse items were 2 stunning silver brooches, but their style was completely alien to Viking craftsmen. They were classic, beautifully preserved examples of Pictish penannular brooches, crafted by the native people who had inhabited Orkney and northern Scotland for centuries before the Vikings arrived. This was not loot. The brooches showed no signs of being torn from a garment. They were placed with care as cherished personal possessions. So how did a Norse woman come to own and be buried with such distinctive Pictish jewelry? This is the core of the scar mystery. The conventional historical narrative often speaks of the Viking arrival in Scotland as a sudden, violent replacement, the ruthless Norse wiping out or subjugating the Pictish people. But this burial paints a far more complex and human picture. One compelling theory is that this group represents some of the very first Norse settlers, perhaps a family of landnamsmen, who arrived not as raiders but as pioneers looking to build a new life. The woman's great age suggests she may have been born in Norway and made the perilous journey as an older adult, a testament to her strength and the family's commitment to relocation. The presence of the Pictish brooches suggests a relationship that went beyond conquest. Perhaps there was trade, a peaceful exchange of goods between the new arrivals and the natives. Perhaps there was intermarriage, and the woman herself was Pictish, integrated into a Norse family. Or perhaps the brooches were heirlooms from a Pictish grandmother, passed down through a mixed family and carried across the sea as a tangible link to a dual heritage. The child in the grave makes this theory especially powerful, a symbol of the new generation that would grow up in this blended world, a living fusion of Norse and Pictish culture. The Scarboat burial forces us to move beyond the simplistic image of Vikings as mere destroyers. Here, on a secluded Scottish beach, we see the quiet, personal beginnings of a new society. It is a story of migration, adaptation, and the subtle, everyday ways in which cultures meet, mingle, and create something entirely new. They weren't just buried with their weapons, they were buried with their history and their future, a silent testament to the fact that identity is never simple, and that even in death, our most personal treasures tell the richest stories. Now we sail from the windswept shores of Scotland to the strategic heart of the Irish Sea, arriving at the Isle of Man. This small island became a prized stronghold for Norse settlers, a perfect base for controlling trade routes between Ireland, England, and Scotland. Here, on a high hill overlooking the sea near the village of Arbury, we find the Balladoole ship burial, and site that tells a story not just of death, but of a deliberate, brutal takeover. The setting itself is a powerful statement. The Vikings who buried their chieftain here in the 9th century didn't choose an empty plot of land. They selected the most prominent hill in the area, a place that had been a sacred site for the native Celtic people for centuries. It was the location of an ancient Iron Age hill fort, a place of community and defense, and later, a Christian Celtic cemetery with dozens of graves marked by simple stone slabs. The Norse newcomers knew exactly what they were doing. They dug a massive, boat-shaped trench directly through the center of this existing cemetery, ruthlessly cutting through the older Christian burials, shoving aside bones and grave markers to make way for their own leader. This was far more than finding a convenient spot. It was a calculated, symbolic act of domination. By placing their chieftain literally on top of the native dead, they were sending an unmistakable message. Our gods, our power, our traditions now rule this land. It was a spiritual conquest etched into the very earth. The vessel they buried was not a colossal warship but a smaller, clinker-built boat, about 11 meters long, a sturdy craft perfect for the coastal waters and fjords of the Isle of Man. Within this ship, they laid the chieftain to rest. His grave goods were those of a man of high status and a traveler: a shield, a spear, a sword for protection, a cauldron and a knife for sustenance, and a sharpening stone to keep his weapons ready. A bronze-mounted harness and the bits from 2 bridles hinted at horses and mobility on land, but it was the objects from farther afield that revealed his connections: a fine bone comb, likely from Ireland, and a bronze button from the Baltic region, showing he was part of a vast network of trade and raid. Yet, the true mystery of Balladoole, and what sets it so starkly apart, lies in the grim sacrifices that accompanied him. Outside the ship, but within the burial trench, archaeologists made a chilling discovery. They found the complete skeleton of a young woman, placed in the earth alongside the remains of a dismembered horse and the bones of a sheep and a dog. The evidence suggests a horrifying ceremony. The horse had been cut into joints, perhaps as an offering of food for the journey. The woman, however, showed no signs of a violent death on her bones, which points to a more unsettling possibility. She may have been poisoned or strangled, methods that leave no mark on the skeleton. Her placement indicates she was not a high-status wife being honored, but almost certainly a slave, a human offering to serve her master in the afterlife. This practice, while attested in other Viking burials, is shocking to find here on a newly conquered Christian island. It underscores the profound cultural collision that was taking place. The Norse weren't just claiming land, they were imposing their entire worldview. a worldview where such rituals ensured power and status continued beyond death. The Balladoole burial is a frozen moment of conquest. It's the story of a chieftain who was given a powerful send-off, a ritual designed to secure his place in the next world while simultaneously cementing his people's claim to this one, all atop the shattered graves of those they had displaced. Moving from the stark conquest of Balladoole, we journey now to a quieter, more enigmatic site on the windswept Scottish Isle of Colonsay. Here, in the serene curve of Killoran Bay, a very different kind of Viking was laid to rest. Discovered in the late 19th century, this burial didn't contain a sacrificed slave or a vessel plowed through a Christian cemetery. Instead, it presented archaeologists with a fascinating puzzle centered on a single individual and the seemingly contradictory treasures buried with him. His grave goods paint a picture of a man who held two identities in his hands, forcing us to ask a fundamental question about the Viking Age. Where did the line between merchant and raider truly lie? The centerpiece of the burial was a small, clinker-built boat, not a massive warship but a sturdy vessel perfectly suited for navigating the complex coastlines and islands of western Scotland. Inside, the remains of a man were accompanied by a collection of objects that seemed to tell two different stories at once. On one side lay the classic tools of a warrior: a sword, a spear, a shield, and a formidable axe. These were not ceremonial items. They were well-used weapons, the essential toolkit of a Norseman prepared for violence and capable of dealing it out. This was a man who knew how to fight and expected that he might need to do so again, even in the afterlife. But resting beside these instruments of war was something entirely unexpected and utterly significant: a beautifully crafted set of folding bronze scales and a complete collection of finely made weights. This was the absolute essential equipment of a merchant, the very symbol of trade and commerce in the Viking world. These were not crude measuring devices. They were precise, portable, and invaluable. In an era before standardized coinage, trade relied on a system of value by weight, primarily of silver. A merchant would use his scales and a set of trusted weights to measure out hack silver, cut up fragments of brooches, arm rings, and coins, to pay for goods. The presence of this set indicates that this man's wealth and livelihood depended on his ability to conduct fair and accurate transactions. So, who was he? A peaceful trader who carried weapons for self-defense on dangerous routes, or a raider who dabbled in trade to profit from his plunder? The most compelling answer is that he was almost certainly both, and that this combination was not a contradiction at all in the Viking mindset. The Old Norse word for this kind of activity is Viking, which itself means a sea-borne raid or expedition. But the men who went on these expeditions were often the same ones who engaged in trade. A journey across the sea was expensive and risky. The most practical way to fund it was to fill the ship's hold with trade goods: furs, amber, walrus ivory, to sell at a destination. Once there, if a promising opportunity for raiding presented itself, the same crew could quickly swap their scales for swords. The profit motive was the same, only the method of acquisition changed. The Killoran Bay burial is a perfect microcosm of the Viking economy, which was fundamentally a portable economy of opportunity. Success depended on flexibility and the ability to assess a situation and choose the most profitable path. A sheltered bay with a wealthy monastery might represent a target for a raid. A bustling trade town like Dublin or Ladby would be a place to open the scales and negotiate. The man buried in Killoran Bay was likely a master of both arts, a chieftain of a small ship's crew whose authority was based on his ability to provide wealth for his followers, regardless of how it was obtained. His grave tells us that in the Viking world, commerce and conquest were not opposing forces. They were two sides of the same precious silver coin, and a successful leader was expected to be fluent in both. Far from the Scottish Isles, on the rocky coast of Brittany in western France, lies one of the most perplexing and fiery farewells in all of Viking archaeology: the ship burial on the Isle de Groix. Discovered in 1906 and excavated more thoroughly nearly a century later, this site stands alone. It is the only known Viking ship burial in the entirety of France, a country the Norse raided and settled for decades, and its unique, violent rituals have left archaeologists debating its meaning for over a century. The setting itself is dramatic. The island of Gurwa sits off the southern coast of Brittany, a strategic vantage point for controlling maritime traffic in the Bay of Biscay. The burial was placed on a high point of land, a clear statement of power visible from the sea, but the ceremony conducted here was unlike anything found in Norway or the British Isles. The Vikings buried here used a ship that was already old, a sturdy vessel nearly 12 meters long that showed signs of heavy repair. They filled it with an astonishing arsenal for a single man: 2 swords, 2 spears, an axe, a bow and dozens of arrows, and perhaps most remarkably, 3 round shields. This was an overwhelming amount of weaponry, enough to equip a small crew, all dedicated to one individual. They then placed the body of the warrior inside this floating armory and did something extraordinary. They set the entire ship on fire. This act of cremation is the core of the Gurwa mystery. While fire was a known element in some Norse funerary rites, it was almost always used on the body itself on a pyre on land, with the ashes then being placed into the ship. To set the ship ablaze with the body inside is incredibly rare. The heat was so intense it warped the metal of the weapons and scorched the stones of the burial cairn built over the remains. This was not a gentle send-off. It was a spectacular, terrifying inferno, a deliberate and destructive act meant to consume everything. Why such a dramatic display? The answer may lie in the man they were burying and the very particular circumstances of Viking presence in Francia. Unlike the settlers of Scotland or the conquerors of the Isle of Man, the Vikings in this region were often mercenaries, hired by warring Frankish kings to fight their battles. The man in the Gurwa ship was almost certainly one of these elite, high-status warriors, a captain whose loyalty was bought with Frankish silver. The incredible wealth of weapons might not have been just for the afterlife. It could have been a public display of the wealth and status he accrued in Frankish service, a final boast to his prowess. The cremation itself might have been a necessity. If this warrior died in the winter, the frozen ground would have made digging a large burial mound impossible. A fiery cremation on a stone bed would have been a practical, yet no less profound alternative. But there's another, darker theory. The act of burning the ship and its contents so completely feels like a ritual of closure, a definitive ending. It's possible this warrior died far from home, with no kin to oversee a traditional burial. His crew, perhaps preparing to return to Scandinavia or move on to the next campaign, gave him the most spectacular farewell they could muster with the resources at hand, burning his entire world with him to ensure his journey was complete. The Gurwa burial is a powerful, isolated monument to the life of a Viking mercenary, a man who lived by the sword, far from his homeland, and was sent to the afterlife in a blaze of glory that still captures our imagination today. But our journey doesn't end on the European side of the Atlantic, because one of the most controversial and hotly debated Viking mysteries is found not in Scandinavia, but right here in North America, in the historic coastal city of Annapolis, Maryland. The story begins in the late 90s, when amateur archaeologist and historian, Dr. Richard White, was researching a puzzling local landmark known as the Shawl Tower, a strange, conical stone structure that stood on a private estate. As he investigated, he was drawn to a nearby earthen mound, and what he claims to have found there would, if proven true, rewrite the history books entirely. He announced the discovery of what he believed was a Viking-age boat burial, complete with the classic tell-tale sign, a distinct pattern of iron rivets, the kind used in the clinker-built construction of Norse ships, arranged in the unmistakable, graceful curve of a hull. According to White, this wasn't just a random scattering of metal. The rivets formed a pattern consistent with a small nar, a Viking trading vessel roughly 10 meters long, the perfect type of ship for a long exploratory voyage. He argued that the body of the ship had long since rotted away in the soil, leaving behind only these metal fasteners as a ghostly outline. Furthermore, he connected this find directly to the mysterious stone tower, proposing that it wasn't a colonial-era folly as many believed, but a navigational marker or even a ceremonial structure built by these pre-Columbian Norse explorers, using it as a central point of reference in a new and unfamiliar land. The implications were staggering. This would place Norse settlers on the Chesapeake Bay centuries before John Smith, and over 500 years before Columbus, suggesting a previously unknown chapter of transatlantic contact. Unsurprisingly, this claim was met with immediate and intense skepticism from the academic archaeological community. Mainstream scholars pointed out that the site lacked any of the other crucial evidence that defines a Viking ship burial. There were no grave goods, no swords, no shields, no tools, no personal ornaments. There were no human remains, no signs of a burial chamber, and no evidence of the ritual sacrifices seen in sites like Balladoole or Ladby. Critics argued that the arrangement of rivets could be coincidental, perhaps the remnants of a much later, colonial-era boat that had been burned or abandoned. They dismissed the connection to the stone tower as pure speculation, noting that its construction style is consistent with other 18th and 19th century garden structures built on wealthy American estates. The overwhelming consensus was that this was a case of misinterpretation, a classic example of an enthusiast seeing what they wanted to see in a jumble of old iron, a pattern imposed on chaos rather than discovered within it. The debate surrounding the Annapolis site highlights the delicate and often fraught relationship between alternative history and mainstream archaeology. For proponents, the establishment is too quick to dismiss anything that challenges the conventional narrative, clinging to dogma and refusing to follow the evidence wherever it may lead. For professional archaeologists, standards of evidence are paramount. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and a handful of rivets without any supporting cultural context is simply not enough to overturn a well-established historical timeline. The burden of proof, they argue, rests on those making the claim, and so far, that burden has not been met with conclusive, peer-reviewed evidence. This standoff leaves the Annapolis boat burial in a state of limbo, a captivating story and a tantalizing possibility for some, but for most experts, an intriguing but ultimately unproven anomaly, a mystery that continues to whisper from the soil without yet revealing its true secret. While the debate over the Annapolis burial remains unresolved, there is one Viking ship mystery where modern science is providing undeniable, breathtaking answers, revolutionizing our understanding in real time. This story begins not with a farmer's spade, but with a scientist and a radically different kind of tool. In the spring of 2018, a team from the Norwegian Institute for Cultural Heritage Research, or NIKU, was conducting a large-scale survey of the fields around the monumental Gel Mound in southeastern Norway. Using a tractor-mounted ground-penetrating radar system, they were methodically scanning the Earth, hoping to map any archaeological features around the known site. The data that streamed onto their screens, however, revealed something far more spectacular than anyone had dared to hope. Beneath the topsoil, in crisp, stunning detail, appeared the perfect ghostly outline of a Viking ship. 20 meters long, with its prow and stern clearly defined, it was a complete ship burial, hidden for over a millennium and now revealed without a single shovel of earth being turned. This was the Gokstad ship, and its discovery instantly became one of the most significant archaeological events of the century. The radar images were so clear that experts could immediately identify it as a vessel built in the classic clinker-built tradition, likely from the later Viking Age around the year 800 or 900. The data didn't just show the ship, it painted a complete picture of the burial. The scans revealed that the ship had been placed in a large trench, and that the mound built over it had been later deliberately leveled, explaining why it had remained invisible on the surface for so long. Most excitingly, the radar detected the clear signatures of several other structures surrounding the ship, what appear to be the remains of a feasting hall and at least 13 other burial mounds, suggesting Gokstad was not an isolated grave, but the centerpiece of a major, unknown Viking Age power center, a lost valley of the kings that we never knew existed. The sheer clarity of the discovery was a triumph of non-invasive technology, a moment that proved we can now peer into the past without damaging it, but that pristine condition presented an immediate and urgent problem. Subsequent analysis of soil samples revealed a silent, microscopic crisis unfolding just inches from the ship's hull. A particularly aggressive and resilient type of fungus was found to be actively consuming the oak wood of the ship itself. With every passing season, with every shift in moisture and temperature, this organism was steadily destroying the vessel, eating away at a priceless piece of history. The digital revelation came with a cruel countdown. If left in the ground, the Gokstad ship would simply rot away to nothing. This dire threat triggered a race against time, leading to the first full excavation of a Viking ship in Norway since the Oseberg ship over a century ago. In 2020, archaeologists began the meticulous, years-long process of uncovering the ship, piece by fragile piece. The central question driving the excavation is one that has captivated the world. What or who is inside? The radar hints at a large, metallic object near the center of the ship, a signature that could be a hoard of weapons, a collection of ornate artifacts, or something entirely unexpected. The potential for a completely undisturbed burial chamber is what makes Gokstad such a tantalizing mystery. Unlike the looted Gokstad mound or the puzzlingly empty Ladby ship, there is a very real hope that the central burial here remains intact, sealed and protected for over 1,000 years. The contents of that chamber have the potential to rewrite chapters of Viking history. Could it hold the remains of a king or queen unknown to the sagas? Could the grave goods include artifacts from cultures we never knew the Vikings contacted? The location itself is a clue. Situated in a region that was a crucible of political power struggles leading to the unification of Norway. The person deemed worthy of such a magnificent send-off in this specific location was undoubtedly a key player in that drama. Every artifact recovered, from the smallest bead to the largest sword, will provide crucial data not just on the individual, but on the trade networks, artistic styles, and religious beliefs of their time. The Gokstad ship is a sealed envelope from the Viking Age, and we are now, finally, carefully opening it, ready to read a story we've never heard before. Yet, as we marvel at the technology uncovering new sites like Gokstad, we must also turn our attention to a ship burial discovery that predates them all, a find so magnificent it redefined our understanding of early medieval Europe. Our journey now takes us across the North Sea to the quiet fields of Suffolk, England, and to a mystery that stands at the very crossroads of cultures, the Great Sutton Hoo Ship Burial. Discovered in 1939 on the eve of World War II, this was not a Viking grave, but an Anglo-Saxon one, the final resting place of a powerful king of the Kingdom of East Anglia, likely Reedwold, who died around 625. But to dismiss it as unrelated to our story would be a profound mistake, for Sutton, who is shrouded in a captivating debate over its deep and undeniable connections to the Scandinavian world, a ghost of Viking practices yet to come. The centerpiece of the burial is, of course, the ship itself. A colossal vessel, 27 meters long, was dragged from the nearby river Deben and lowered into a massive trench to serve as a coffin. The organic wood had long since vanished, leaving behind a perfect, ghostly impression in the sand, a negative space outlined by thousands of rusted iron rivets. The act of ship burial itself is the first and most powerful clue. This was not a common practice in 6th or 7th century England. In fact, Sutton, who is utterly unique in the Anglo-Saxon archaeological record for its scale and preservation. But it was a deeply established tradition in Scandinavia, with precursors at sites like Vendel and Valskade in Sweden. The very idea of sending a high-status individual to the afterlife in a seagoing vessel points a compelling arrow northwards, suggesting the East Anglian elite were intimately aware of, and perhaps even emulating, customs from across the water. This connection is hammered home, quite literally, in the burial's most iconic treasure, the Sutton Hoo helmet. This masterpiece of protective gear and symbolic power is undoubtedly Anglo-Saxon in its ownership and final assembly. Yet, every time we look upon its fierce face mask, with its soaring eyebrows, nose guard, and mustache, we are staring directly into the eyes of a Swedish predecessor. The design is strikingly similar to helmets found in those same Swedish burial mounds at Vendel. The intricate pressblech designs, thin sheets of stamped bronze depicting warrior scenes, are executed in a nearly identical artistic style. This wasn't casual imitation. It was a direct and conscious adoption of a specific Scandinavian elite cultural symbol. A king in East Anglia was choosing to be portrayed with the same terrifying visage as a chieftain in Uppsala, a powerful statement about the source of his authority and his desired identity. The artistic evidence continues throughout the treasure. The great gold and garnet belt buckle is a technical marvel of Anglo-Saxon goldsmithing, but the interlacing beasts that writhe across its surface belong to a broader Northern European artistic language. The style, known as Animal Style 1 or Style 2, features elongated, sinuous creatures with interlacing limbs that are characteristic of Germanic art from both sides of the North Sea. The cloisonné garnet work on the purse lid and shoulder clasps finds stunning parallels in jewelry from Sweden. These parallels suggest more than just traded goods. They hint at shared artistic workshops, moving craftsmen, or diplomatic gifts exchanged between royal courts. These objects proclaim that the Kingdom of East Anglia was no isolated backwater. It was a sophisticated, wealthy player in a vast North Sea network, a network where ideas, artists, and symbols flowed as freely as silver and amber. So, what are we to make of this king? The prevailing theory identifies him as Riedwald, a king recorded by the Venerable Bede as achieving the high title of Bretwalda, or Britain ruler. His reign was a complex balancing act between competing worlds. He was baptized a Christian, likely for political advantage in dealing with other Christian kingdoms, but Bede tells us he later reverted to his pagan beliefs, maintaining a temple with altars to both the Christian god and the Old Norse deities. This paints a picture of a pragmatic and powerful ruler, navigating the turbulent waters of faith and politics. His burial at Sutton who reflects this duality. There are no overtly Christian symbols in the grave. Instead, it is a profoundly pagan send-off, filled with symbols of power, warfare, and a belief in a journey to an afterlife where his status would be maintained. The use of a ship, a potent pagan symbol, alongside such obviously Scandinavian-inspired gear, suggests he and his court looked to the pagan north, to the world of the Norse gods and heroes, as a fundamental source of their power and identity. Sutton who therefore is not a Viking burial, but it is a brilliant, golden prelude. It shows us the cultural world that the Vikings would later explode from, and it proves that the North Sea was a highway of ideas long before the first dragon-proud longships set out on their famous raids. If the fiery send-off on the Isle de Groix was a spectacular anomaly, the story of the Myklebust ship takes the concept of a Viking cremation to its logical, and utterly breathtaking, extreme. We return now to Norway, to a farm in the village of Myklebust near the formidable Nordfjord, where in 1874, a landowner named Anders Lorange made a discovery that was both magnificent and deeply puzzling. Unlike the perfectly preserved hulls of Oseberg and Gokstad, there was no elegant wooden prow to be found here. Instead, as the soil was cleared away, workers uncovered a gargantuan, ghostly outline, a vast, ship-shaped stain in the earth, measuring a staggering 30 meters from stem to stern. This made it the largest Viking ship ever discovered, a true leviathan of the seas, and it was filled not with wood, but with a dense, chaotic layer of over 3,000 iron rivets, all of them warped, twisted, and fused together by unimaginable heat. This was not a burial. It was the aftermath of a titanic inferno, the cremated remains of a ship that had been set ablaze in a farewell of epic proportions. The sheer scale of the vessel immediately presents a profound mystery. Building a ship of this size would have been a staggering undertaking, a project that consumed the resources of an entire community for years. It represented an almost unimaginable concentration of wealth and power. The man deemed worthy of such a monument must have been a figure of near legendary status, a paramount chieftain, or perhaps even a king whose name echoed across the fjords. And yet, his identity is one of the site's most enduring secrets. The cremation process was so complete, so utterly destructive, that it consumed almost all organic material, including the warrior's body and most of his grave goods. We are left with the haunting silhouette of his power, but the man himself has been erased by the very fire meant to honor him. The few objects that survive the flames are tantalizing clues: the fragments of a magnificent gilded bronze bridle, a ceremonial drinking horn, a sword, a shield boss, and a single stunning artifact, a large, ornate bird of prey, crafted from gilded bronze with sharp, predatory eyes. This was likely the crest from a magnificent helmet, a symbol of Odinic power that marked its owner as a leader chosen by the gods themselves. This collection of elite objects points to an individual at the absolute pinnacle of Scandinavian society in the late 9th century, a time of immense political upheaval as Harald Fairhair fought to forge the first unified kingdom of Norway. The location of the burial is itself a critical clue. The Nordfjord region was a heartland of resistance against Harald's unifying campaign, a bastion of powerful, independent chieftains who fiercely defended their ancient autonomy. This context gives us a compelling theory. The man buried at Myklubust may have been one of these defiant regional kings, perhaps even the famous Oddbjorn of the Furdir, whom the sagas record as dying in battle against Harald Fairhair's forces. His spectacular funeral, then, would have been far more than a simple send-off. It would have been a powerful political statement, a defiant act of cultural resilience staged by his followers. By sending their fallen leader into the afterlife in the largest ship ever built, consumed by a fire visible for miles, they were proclaiming that his legacy, and the old order he represented, would not be so easily extinguished. The Myklubust ship is a phantom of a forgotten king, a monument to a world that was vanishing in the smoke of Harald Fairhair's conquests, its story told not in preserved wood, but in the twisted, fiery metal it left behind. But the evolution of ship burials reaches its most dramatic and fiery conclusion not in a foreign land, but back in the heart of Norway, demanding a final, spectacular farewell. If the Myklubust ship represents the ultimate cremation, then the vast, rolling fields at Bora present us with a different kind of mystery altogether, one not of a single king, but of an entire dynasty. Nestled on the western shore of the Oslofjord in Vestfold, the Bora Mound Cemetery isn't just a collection of graves. It is a sprawling, monumental landscape of power, the largest known concentration of monumental burial mounds from the Viking Age in all of Scandinavia. This was not a place for a single chieftain's send-off. This was the sacred, ancestral ground for a line of kings, a physical declaration of a family's right to rule that endured for centuries. Walking through the park today, you are surrounded by the ghosts of giants. 9 massive mounds still dominate the skyline, with the largest, known as the Midgard Serpent for its immense size, reaching over 45 meters in diameter and 7 meters high. But archaeological surveys suggest there were once at least 25 such mounds here, alongside countless smaller graves, creating a vast necropolis that would have been visible from the vital sea lane of the Oslofjord. Every ship sailing to the important trading center at Koppang would have passed this awe-inspiring display, a constant reminder of the formidable power and deep roots of the dynasty that controlled this land. The very geography speaks of calculated dominance, a statement etched permanently into the earth. The central mystery of Bora is a dual one: who was buried here, and what made this specific location so significant for such an extended period. The mounds themselves have been plundered and damaged over the centuries, so the spectacular preservation of a Gokstad or Oseberg is not to be found. Early excavations in the 1850s and 80s did, however, reveal tantalizing clues. Within one of the largest mounds, explorers found the remains of a truly spectacular ship burial. They discovered over 100 iron rivets and the outline of a vessel estimated to be at least 20 meters long. But the most stunning find was a collection of gilt bronze horse harness fittings, exquisitely crafted in the very same gripping beast style that defines the Oseberg carvings. This style, in fact, is named the Bora style after this discovery, marking this site as a crucible of Viking Age art and culture. The quality of these items is breathtaking, indicating the burial of individuals at the very apex of wealth and authority. So which royal family claimed Bora as their own? The most compelling theory connects the site to the Ungling dynasty, the semi-legendary royal house said to have descended from the god Freyr. The sagas, particularly the Unglinga saga, describe a line of kings buried in mounds at Bora, establishing it as their ancestral home. This would make it the burial ground for the predecessors of Harald Fairhair, the king who would eventually unite Norway. If true, Bora is the physical manifestation of the power base Harald sprang from, the seat of the very kings he surpassed. But the saga records are poetic and often unreliable, written centuries after the fact. The challenge for modern archaeology is to move beyond the legends and find concrete evidence in the soil. This is where cutting-edge science is beginning to peel back the layers of this 1,000-year-old mystery. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys, similar to those used at Gokstad, have revealed astonishing new details hidden beneath the grass. The scans have confirmed the presence of several ship settings, circular or boat-shaped arrangements of stones that often marked a grave, suggesting that ship burials were indeed a recurring tradition here, not a one-off event. Even more intriguingly, the radar has detected the ghostly outlines of several large, hall-like structures surrounding the mounds. This suggests Bora was not just a cemetery, it was a thriving power center, a place where the living rulers would feast and govern in the shadow of their illustrious ancestors, drawing authority from their proximity to the sacred dead. The ongoing archaeological work is now focused on carefully excavating these peripheral areas, hoping to find organic remains, refuse pits, and artifacts that can tell us about the daily lives of the people who built this kingdom. Each piece of charcoal from a fire, each broken piece of pottery, and each lost game piece adds a stitch to the tapestry, helping us understand the society that could command the resources to raise these colossal earthen monuments generation after generation. Bora's mystery is less about a single individual and more about the very nature of power and legacy in the Viking Age. It represents the institutionalization of authority, the transition from a single powerful chieftain to a lasting dynasty that could hold onto power for centuries, using the awe-inspiring presence of their burial ground as a potent tool of political propaganda. It is a silent, sprawling stone and earth chronicle of how a family of local rulers grew into the founders of a nation. Now, after exploring the grand mounds and fiery pyres of kings, we come to a Viking ship that tells a completely different kind of story, one not of earthly power, but of deep, spiritual obligation. Nestled in a quiet Norwegian fjord near the village of Kvalsund, this vessel wasn't buried on a hill for all to see. It was hidden beneath the water, deliberately sunk in the soft mud of the estuary, as if returned to the realm from which it came. Discovered in the early 1920s by farmers digging for peat, the Kvalsund ship immediately stood out as an enigma. It wasn't a grand warship designed to terrify coasts, nor a deep-bellied nar built for Atlantic trade. This was a smaller, more delicate vessel, and its entire existence seems to have been dedicated not to the living, but to the gods. The mystery begins with its construction. The ship itself is a fascinating hybrid, a bridge between two worlds. At just 18 meters long, it shares the elegant clinker-built design of its seafaring cousins, with overlapping planks riveted together. But a closer look reveals crucial differences that mark it as something entirely unique. Its frame is much lighter, its hull shallower and broader, giving it a noticeably wider beam. Most tellingly, its keel is little more than a flattened plank, utterly unlike the deep, robust keels of ocean-going ships like the Gokstad, which were engineered to bite into the waves and provide stability in rough seas. A keel like the one on the Kvalsund ship would have made it dangerously unstable and sluggish in open water, practically begging to be capsized by a strong wind or a large wave. This was not a ship built for a practical journey across the North Sea. So what was its purpose? This is where we enter the realm of ritual. The condition in which it was found points to a deliberate, ceremonial offering. The ship wasn't wrecked or abandoned. It was carefully and intentionally scuttled in the sheltered, shallow waters of the fjord, placed with a purpose. Even more intriguingly, It was buried alongside a smaller, 6-meter-long boat, creating a nested set of offerings. The larger ship was equipped with oars and a steering oar, but no mast step was found, meaning it was never meant to carry a sail. It was a rowing vessel, and a fragile one at that, designed for calmer, protected waters. All of this evidence strongly suggests that this ship was never intended for a mortal passenger. It wasn't built to carry a chieftain to Valhalla. It was constructed specifically to be given to the gods, a sacrificial gift sunk into the watery domain of deities like Njord or Aegir, who ruled the seas and the fortunes of sailors. But why would a community go to the enormous expense of building an entire ship, a tremendously valuable asset, only to immediately destroy it? The answer lies in the fundamental Norse concept of the gift cycle. In their worldview, a relationship with the gods was a reciprocal exchange. To receive favor, good harvests, victory in battle, safe passage across the sea, you had to give something of proportional value. What could be more valuable to a coastal, seafaring people than a ship? By offering a perfectly good vessel, the community was making the ultimate investment in their own survival. They were essentially saying, "We give you this symbol of our wealth and our livelihood, O gods, so that you might grant us protection and prosperity in return." It was a spiritual transaction of the highest order. The Kvalsund ship, therefore, forces us to expand our definition of a Viking ship burial. It shows us that not all sacred vessels were tombs, and not all ceremonies were about honoring the dead. Some were about ensuring the future of the living, a profound sacrifice made to unseen forces, hidden not in a mound of earth, but in the silent, dark waters of a fjord, waiting for centuries to reveal its quiet, devotional secret. Far to the north of the Orkney Islands, on the remote and rugged Ardnamurchan Peninsula, the westernmost point of the British mainland, a discovery was made that speaks not of cultural blending, but of raw, established power. In 2011, archaeologists working on a hillside overlooking the sea unearthed something entirely unexpected. A Viking boat grave, the first to be found on the UK mainland in decades and one of the most complete ever discovered in Scotland. This was the Port and Eilean Emhuar burial, and it tells the story of a man who didn't just visit this landscape. He owned it, and he was laid to rest there as a permanent declaration of his authority. The vessel itself was a small but sturdy boat, about 5 meters long, a type the Norse would have used for navigating the complex sea lobs and inlets of the Scottish coast. Time had rotted the wood away, leaving behind a dark, boat-shaped stain in the earth and over 200 rusted iron rivets that outlined the hull with perfect clarity. Within this outline lay the remains of a single individual, a high-status man who had been given a profoundly traditional Norse send-off, complete with a formidable arsenal of grave goods. Buried with him was a heavy, fearsome battle axe, its cutting edge still sharp after centuries in the ground, a symbol of the brutal, close-quarters combat that defined Viking warfare. By his side lay a sword, the ultimate mark of a warrior aristocracy, its hilt decorated and its blade a testament to his status. A spearhead suggested another weapon for thrusting or throwing, and a single shield boss, the metal center of a wooden shield, hinted at his means of defense. But perhaps the most personal and evocative item was a bronze-ringed pin, used to fasten a cloak, and a large, finely crafted drinking horn with bronze fittings. This last item transforms him from a mere fighter into a social being. This was a chieftain who would have feasted with his followers, sharing stories and mead from that very horn, strengthening the bonds of loyalty that were the true foundation of his power. The presence of this burial in such a specific location is what makes it so historically significant. Ardnamurchan is not a soft, easily farmed land. It is a place of breathtaking beauty and harsh, demanding terrain. To choose this spot for a permanent grave means this chieftain had a deep, vested interest in this particular piece of ground. He wasn't a raider who died on a fleeting summer expedition. He was a settler, a lord who had carved out a territory for himself and his people. The grave was placed on a prominent natural terrace, a place of high visibility overlooking the sea lanes he would have controlled. This was a strategic statement in stone and earth, a message to any who sailed past that this land was claimed, defended, and under the protection of a powerful Norse lord, even in death. The burial itself acts as a title deed, written not on parchment, but in the arrangement of rivets and weapons. The mystery of port and Eilian Emhoir, then, is not about the objects themselves, which are classic Viking fare, but about the man's precise role in the complex political tapestry of 9th or 10th century Scotland. His grave is a carbon copy of burials found in Norway, utterly devoid of the native Pictish or Gaelic influences seen at Skar. This suggests he was part of a first-generation settlement, a man who maintained a strict Norse identity and demanded to be buried according to the old ways, without compromise. He may have been an independent landowner, a chieftain who answered to no one but himself, exploiting the rich sea resources and imposing his rule on the local population. Alternatively, he could have been a key lieutenant for a greater king, perhaps based in the Hebrides or the Northern Isles, placed there to oversee this strategic outpost and ensure the flow of tribute and loyalty back to a higher power. His grave is a powerful testament to the depth and permanence of the Norse impact, proving that their influence stretched beyond the islands and deep into the very heart of the Scottish Highlands, establishing a legacy of lordship that would shape the region for centuries to come. But the story of Viking presence in Orkney is not just written in their own graves. It is also etched into a landscape already deeply ancient and sacred by the time their longships first appeared on the horizon. To understand the full weight of their choices, we must pull back the camera to view a much broader, more mysterious canvas. Just a short distance from the poignant family burial at Skar and other Norse sites lies a windswept strip of land known as the Ness of Brodgar, a place that has utterly revolutionized our understanding of Neolithic Britain. Here, archaeologists are painstakingly uncovering a vast, sophisticated complex of monumental stone buildings, ceremonial pathways, and intricately carved artwork, a ritual center that was already older than the pyramids when the Vikings arrived. This was a place of immense, lingering power, and the Norse who settled here were undoubtedly aware of its presence, choosing to place their own cemeteries in its long shadow, creating a profound, multi-layered puzzle across the millennia. The Ness of Brodgar complex is staggering in its scale and complexity. Excavations have revealed a huge walled precinct enclosing a series of colossal, beautifully constructed stone buildings, dubbed temples or palaces by the archaeologists who uncovered them. These structures, with their carefully dressed stonework, corner buttresses, and vibrant colored paint, were not homes or farms. They were centers for ceremony, feasting, and gatherings on a scale never before seen in Neolithic Britain. The artifacts found within them are equally extraordinary: beautifully polished stone axes, exquisitely crafted pottery, and thousands of pieces of artwork, including stone slabs carved with intricate geometric patterns, spirals, and zigzags. This was clearly the spiritual and ceremonial heart of Orkney for over 1,000 years, a place that drew people from across the islands and beyond, a locus of belief and community that echoed with ritual for generations. And then, around 2400 BC, it was deliberately, ceremonially decommissioned. The buildings were filled in, the entire site was sealed under a layer of clean clay, and it was abandoned, leaving only the giant stone circles of the Ring of Brodgar and the stones of Stenness standing as silent, surface sentinels to the hidden world beneath. For thousands of years, the true extent of the Ness lay hidden, its secrets buried. When the Norse arrived in Orkney in the 8th and 9th centuries, what would they have seen? They would have seen the two great stone circles, monuments of a scale and craftsmanship that would have been impossible to ignore. They would have seen numerous ancient burial mounds, known as hows, dotting the landscape. The entire peninsula between the Loch of Stenness and the Loch of Herre would have been an obviously ancient, ritualized place. A terrain pregnant with a history they could not possibly have read, but could certainly feel. The question then becomes, why did they choose to build their farms and bury their dead in such close proximity to these alien, monumental relics of a people long gone? One compelling theory is simple pragmatism. The land around the Ness is some of the most fertile ground in Orkney, and the Viking settlers were, above all, practical farmers and pastoralists. They needed good land for their cattle and their barley, and the well-drained soils around the Brodgar Peninsula would have been highly desirable. In this view, the ancient monuments were just inconvenient piles of old stones that got in the way of a good field, their original meaning long forgotten. The Vikings might have seen the standing stones as nothing more than useful landmarks or convenient quarries for building their own homes. There is evidence of this pragmatism elsewhere. The great burial mound of Misho, for instance, was later broken into by Vikings who left behind a famous collection of runic graffiti, treating the ancient tomb not as a sacred space, but as a handy shelter from a storm. However, a more intriguing and poetically resonant possibility is that the Norse recognized the spiritual power of this place and sought to tap into it or co-opt it for their own purposes. We know that the Viking settlers were not cultural blank slates. They brought with them a rich worldview filled with gods, spirits, and sacred landscapes. They believed that certain places in nature, waterfalls, peculiar groves, dramatic mountains were inhabited by landvitir, or land spirits. The sheer scale and obvious artificiality of the Ring of Brodgar and the Stones of Stenness would have marked this area as exceptional, a place where the veil between the worlds might be thin. By burying their own high-status dead within sight of these stones, they could have been performing a powerful act of symbolic possession. It was a way of saying, "Our gods and our ancestors now hold sway here," connecting their new lineage to the deep time of the islands and legitimizing their rule by associating themselves with the most potent and enduring landmarks available. This practice of ancestral one-upmanship, of layering new power atop old, is a recurring theme in history. The Balladoole ship burial on the Isle of Man, where the Norse deliberately dug through an older Christian cemetery, is a direct and aggressive example of this. At the Ness of Brodgar, the interaction may have been more subtle, a quiet absorption of pre-existing sanctity rather than a violent overriding. The Vikings may not have understood who built the circles or why, but they could recognize a center of power when they saw one. Burying their chieftains and warriors, they anchored their community to that power, creating a continuous thread of significance from the Neolithic builders to themselves, weaving their own story into the very oldest fabric of the land. The silence of the stones offered no resistance, and in their enduring presence, they bestowed a borrowed eternity upon the newcomers, making the Viking claim on Orkney feel less like an invasion and more like a destiny. Yet for all the grandeur of these great ship burials, with their preserved wood and treasure, there exists another, far more common and enduring monument scattered across the Scandinavian landscape. Travel through Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, and you will find them in fields and on hillsides, elegant, elongated ovals and graceful curves of standing stones, arranged with meticulous care to form the unmistakable outline of a ship's hull. These are stone ship settings, and they present a mystery that is both simpler and more profound than the burials we've explored. Without wood to preserve a body or artifacts to tell a story, these silent stone sentinels force us to ask a deeper question about Viking belief. When a physical ship was beyond reach, what was the power of its symbol? The most immediate and practical theory is that these settings were essentially a budget-friendly version of a ship burial. The resources required to build a seaworthy vessel, especially one large enough for a chieftain, were staggering. It represented hundreds of hours of skilled labor from shipwrights and the consumption of vast amounts of high-quality timber. For a wealthy jarl or a king, this was a worthy investment for their final journey. But for a prosperous farmer, a successful merchant, or a well-respected warrior from a lesser family, such an expense would have been impossible. A stone ship setting offered a powerful alternative. By carefully selecting and placing stones to mirror the shape and proportions of a longship, a community could create a permanent, monumental representation of that vessel. It was a way to confer the same spiritual status and honor upon the deceased without the ruinous cost, ensuring their passage to the afterlife was secured through symbolism rather than literal sacrifice. Another compelling idea connects these monuments to the very real and ever-present dangers of the sea. The Viking Age was built upon maritime travel, which was inherently treacherous. Storms, navigational errors, and shipwrecks would have claimed countless lives, leaving families with no body to bury and no closure. A stone ship setting may have served as a cenotaph, a memorial for those whose graves were the waves themselves. By building this symbolic ship on solid ground, the community could provide a focal point for their grief and a place for the soul of the lost sailor to be honored and remembered. It anchored them to the land of their ancestors, ensuring they weren't forgotten simply because the sea had refused to give them back. In this light, the stone ships are poignant landmarks of loss, a way for the living to reclaim their loved ones from the anonymity of the ocean. However, the most fascinating possibility is that these settings were never intended as cheap substitutes or mere memorials, but were instead powerful ritual structures in their own right, charged with a symbolic meaning that was just as potent as a real ship. In the Norse worldview, the concept of symbolism was not a weak imitation of reality. It was a way to capture and harness its essence. The shape of the ship was intimately tied to the sun's journey across the sky, a daily cycle of death and rebirth. By arranging stones in this specific, sacred form, participants in a funeral rite could effectively create a vessel for the soul. The ceremony might have involved processions within the stone outline, prayers and offerings, all designed to activate the symbol and launch the deceased on their journey to the afterlife. This ritual function might explain why we often find stone settings not in isolation, but in large groups, forming entire fields of stone ships. At places like Annans Mound in Sweden, the scale is breathtaking, with multiple large settings creating a ritual landscape dedicated to the dead. This suggests these were sites of recurring ceremonial activity, not just single graves. The ship shape was the crucial component, a required form for a successful spiritual transition. Whether built of wood or stone, the outline itself was the key that unlocked the door to the next world. These enduring stone outlines, then, are not poor imitations of greater burials. They are a testament to the resilience and adaptability of a belief system, proving that for the Vikings, the idea of the ship could be just as seaworthy as the vessel itself, capable of carrying the soul to Valhalla on a hull built not of oak, but of faith. But as we've sailed through these incredible discoveries, from the royal splendor of Oseberg to the ghostly outline of Gokstad, a pressing question begins to form. If these ship burials represent the ultimate Viking farewell, a send-off fit for kings and queens, then what about everyone else? The staggering truth is that these monumental burials are the rarest of exceptions. For every chieftain laid to rest in a majestic longship, thousands upon thousands of Vikings were committed to the earth in ways that have left far fainter traces. This disparity forces us to confront a profound social mystery. In a culture defined by the sea, who was granted this extraordinary honor, and perhaps more tellingly, who was denied it? The first and most significant filter was undoubtedly wealth and social standing. Building a seaworthy vessel was an astronomically expensive undertaking, a massive drain on any community's resources. It required the finest, carefully selected oak planks, the skilled labor of master shipwrights for months on end, and the forfeiture of an asset that could be used for trade, raid, or fishing. To then bury that ship, effectively taking it out of the economy forever, was a display of power so blatant it borders on the obscene. This was not an act a common farmer could ever authorize. The individual in the grave had to be someone whose death threatened the very stability of the community, a paramount chieftain, a legendary warrior, or a ruler whose connection to the gods was so vital that their passage to the afterlife had to be guaranteed with the community's most valuable possession. This person was almost always at the very apex of the social hierarchy, someone who controlled land, resources, and the loyalties of many people. The role of gender in this selection is particularly fascinating and complex. The stunning discovery of the two women in the Oseberg ship definitively proves that women could achieve the highest status required for such a burial. But this was not the rule. The overwhelming majority of identified ship burials contain men, typically accompanied by the weapons of a warrior. This aligns with the classic image of the Viking male ideal, the seafaring fighter, the explorer, the ring giver to his band of followers. His identity was intrinsically linked to the ship. It was the instrument of his power and the source of his wealth. Sending him off in it was a logical culmination of his life's work. For a woman to be accorded the same honor, she must have wielded power in a different, but no less critical, sphere. She wouldn't be celebrated for raiding, but perhaps for her lineage, her ownership of land, her role as a priestess or a keeper of spiritual knowledge, or her political acumen in holding a family or a region together in the absence of men. The Oseberg woman, whether queen or Valva, didn't need to be a warrior. Her authority came from another, equally formidable source. Occupation also played a crucial role. The man buried in the Scar boat with his sword was a warrior, but the one in Killerin Bay with his scales was likely a merchant, and both were deemed worthy. This tells us that the key wasn't a specific job title, but the scale of success and influence achieved in that field. A wildly successful merchant who funded expeditions and commanded a crew could accumulate the same wealth and loyalty as a successful raider. The ship was the common denominator. It was the engine of their prosperity, whether through commerce or conquest. A blacksmith, no matter how skilled, or a poet, no matter how revered, would have lacked the fundamental connection to the vessel itself. Their power wasn't maritime. The ship burial was reserved for those whose power and identity were literally built upon the deck of a ship. Ultimately, the vast majority of Vikings received far simpler rites. Most were cremated on pyres, their ashes buried in urns with a few personal items. Others were laid in simple graves, perhaps marked by a mound of stones, accompanied by a single knife, a comb, or a single bead. These were the farmers, the craftspeople, the wives, the children, the entire backbone of Norse society that built the world the chieftains ruled. Their afterlife journey was presumably a more humble one, perhaps relying on faith and familial remembrance rather than a colossal floating chariot. The breathtaking ship burials we marvel at today were never meant for them. They were the exclusive propaganda of the elite, a final, earth-shaking declaration of status designed to awe the living, honor the dead, and cement a family's legacy for generations to come. Their rarity is what makes them so extraordinary. They are the glittering, dramatic tip of a vast social iceberg, the grand finale for the 1% of the Viking world. But this grand tradition of sending chieftains to sea in their ships leads us to a breathtaking, practical mystery that would have been paramount to every Viking who ever lived. How did they actually manage to sail across such vast, terrifying stretches of open ocean in the first place? We've been exploring these magnificent vessels as tombs, but in life, they were the most advanced vehicles of their age, capable of crossing the North Atlantic to reach Iceland, Greenland, and even the shores of North America. The Vikings accomplished these feats of navigation without magnetic compasses, without charts, and without any of the instruments we associate with seamanship. They relied on a profound, intimate knowledge of the natural world, a suite of skills so effective they remain partially shrouded in secret to this day. And while archaeologists have never discovered a definitive navigational tool within a ship burial, the absence itself is a clue, pointing to a technology that was either too commonplace to be considered grave goods or too ethereal to be buried, a knowledge carried not in the hand, but in the mind. The most legendary of these proposed tools is the Solsteiner, or Sunstone. This isn't a mythical object from a saga, it's a compelling scientific theory. On the perpetually overcast days that dominate the North Atlantic, when the sun is completely hidden behind a blanket of gray cloud, a navigator would be utterly lost. But certain crystals, like Iceland spar, a form of calcite that is transparent and has unique optical properties, can cut through the glare. When you look through such a crystal and rotate it, you can detect the polarization of sunlight, a pattern invisible to the naked eye that reveals the sun's position with remarkable accuracy, even when it's completely obscured. A skilled navigator could hold this stone up to the sky, turn it until the light patterns aligned, and instantly know where the sun was, giving them a fixed celestial point to steer by. It was a kind of magic, but magic grounded in the immutable laws of physics. The theory gained tremendous credibility when a crystal of Iceland spar was found aboard a 16th century English shipwreck, but for the Vikings, it remains in the realm of the probable. These stones would have been small, personal, and incredibly valuable, the kind of tool a navigator might have kept on his person his entire life, perhaps even passed down to an apprentice, making it unlikely to be tossed into a burial chamber. Its value was in its use, not its display. Beyond any single tool, the ultimate Viking navigation system was a deep, accumulated library of environmental clues, learned over a lifetime and passed down through generations in song and story. They were masters of dead reckoning, constantly tracking their speed, the time traveled, and the direction they were heading. They watched the ocean itself like a text, reading the patterns of the waves. Swell patterns created by prevailing winds could act as a steady guide. A navigator would know the feel of the swell from his home fjord, and could use its direction to maintain a course long after land had disappeared from view. The color of the water, its temperature, and the type of seaweed floating in it told them if they were sailing over shallow continental shelves or in the deep, open ocean. The behavior of wildlife was another crucial signpost. A sailor knowing that certain species of whale preferred specific currents, or that flocks of particular seabirds would fly out to sea to feed in the morning and return to land to roost at night, could follow those birds home to safe harbor. A lost navigator might even release a raven from a cage on board. The bird, seeking land, would fly in a straight line towards it, giving the ship its bearing. This incredible skill set transformed their ships from simple boats into vehicles of epic exploration. It was this knowledge that allowed the Nar, the sturdy cargo ship, to carry settlers and their entire way of life to Iceland and Greenland. It was this expertise that guided the sleek longship on its lightning raids, appearing off a foreign coast as if from nowhere. And in a poignant, final connection, it was this same intimate understanding of the sea that would have been used for one last, solemn voyage not to a new land, but to a final resting place. The crew that hauled the Gokstad ship ashore, or the community that carefully arranged the Oseberg vessel in its trench, would have used these very techniques to choose the site and navigate to it. They selected prominent locations visible from sea lanes, ensuring the burial mound would serve as a permanent navigational marker, a reminder of the chieftain's power for every ship that passed. The buried ship was a symbol of a journey ended, but its placement was a fixed point on a chart, a testament to the skills that made the journey possible. The navigator's art was so fundamental to their identity that it didn't need to be entombed. It was the invisible current that carried their entire world. This deliberate act of damaging the ship presents one of the most curious and counterintuitive rituals of all. After investing an enormous amount of resources and skilled labor to build a magnificent, seaworthy vessel, the community would then perform a final, violent act upon it. In many burials, including the Gokstad ship, archaeologists discovered that holes had been deliberately drilled into the hull planks. This wasn't accidental damage or the result of decay. These were clean, intentional bore marks. The same practice is seen elsewhere, with rudders or oars being broken, or sacred objects being ritually bent. On the surface, this seems like pure vandalism, a bewildering destruction of a perfectly good ship. But in the Viking worldview, this act was likely the most crucial part of the entire ceremony, a necessary step to transform the vessel from a tool of the living into a sacred object for the dead. One compelling theory is that this was a practical measure, a form of ritualistic security. A ship was an asset of incredible value, and the temptation to retrieve such a prize from a burial mound might have been overwhelming for someone facing a hard winter or planning a raid. By drilling holes in the hull or breaking the rudder, the community rendered the ship completely useless for any mortal purpose. It could never be stolen and sailed again. This physically enforced the finality of the gift, ensuring that the immense wealth invested in the vessel remained dedicated solely to the honoree. It was a permanent seal on the tomb, protecting both the grave goods from theft and the community from the sacrilege of desecrating a chieftain's resting place. The act sent a clear, unambiguous message. This ship belongs to the dead now, and its use in the world of the living is forever concluded. However, the reasoning likely went far deeper than simple deterrence. The Norse believed that objects could possess a spirit or a life force of their own, a concept known as hamingja. A ship that had carried a chieftain to victory in battle, that had weathered North Atlantic storms, and that had been the home to his crew for months at a time would have been seen as more than just wood and iron. It was a living entity with its own history and reputation. For this vessel to serve its master in the afterlife, its spirit needed to be released from its physical form, just as the chieftain's spirit was released from his body. The act of killing the ship by piercing its hull, breaking its spine, or shattering its rudder was a sympathetic ritual. It was a way of freeing the ship's spirit from its earthly constraints, allowing it to travel with the owner to the realms of the gods. A perfectly intact ship would be just a hollow, physical shell. A ritually killed ship was a spirit vessel, ready for an eternal voyage. This belief connects to a broader theme in Norse mythology, that nothing of value comes without sacrifice. The gods themselves gained wisdom, power, and the very runes through acts of intense personal sacrifice. Odin hung himself from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, to gain knowledge of the runes. This concept was baked into their cultural DNA. To gain the immense spiritual and political payoff of a successful ship burial, to ensure the chieftain's safe passage, and to proclaim the family's continued status, a great sacrifice had to be made. The destruction of the ship was that ultimate sacrifice. It was the community willingly and visibly destroying a huge portion of its own collective wealth for a higher purpose. The more valuable the thing they destroyed, the more powerful the ritual became. The hole drilled into the hull wasn't just damage, it was the wound that made the sacrifice valid, the necessary price for a ticket to the afterlife. This final, destructive act was the closing argument of the funeral, proving through irreversible action that their devotion was absolute and that their leader's journey would not fail. Yet beneath this official narrative of replacement lies a more complex and fascinating story of cultural absorption and hidden persistence. The transition to Christianity was not an instantaneous flip of a switch across all of Scandinavia. It was a slow, uneven process that took centuries, ebbing and flowing with the political fortunes of kings and local chieftains. In more remote valleys and isolated fjords, pagan beliefs and practices held on with a tenacious grip, often merging with the new faith in creative, almost invisible ways. While the grand public spectacle of the ship burial vanished, its symbolic heart may have simply been transplanted into a new form. Consider the shape of the earliest Christian churches in Norway and Sweden. Many were built with a distinctively long, narrow nave and a rounded apse, creating a silhouette that, from above, bears a startling resemblance to a Viking longship with its sweeping prow and stern. Were these architects, likely converts themselves, unconsciously echoing the sacred vessel shape that had carried souls to the afterlife for generations? It's a compelling possibility, suggesting that the deep-seated spiritual connection to the ship was too powerful to erase completely, finding a new home within the very architecture of the new religion. Furthermore, the concept of a journey to the afterlife did not disappear with the adoption of Christianity. It was simply rerouted. The Viking soul no longer needed a physical ship to navigate the waters to Valhalla or Folkvanger. Instead, the journey became a metaphysical one, guided by prayer, penance, and faith, with the final destination now being heaven or hell. The church offered its own vessels for this spiritual passage. Prayers were often symbolized as ships carrying souls to salvation, and the church itself was frequently referred to as a ship or ark of safety in a sinful world. In this way, the core idea of a vessel for transcendence was preserved, but its form was dematerialized, moving from the realm of oak and iron into the realm of words and belief. This wasn't a complete eradication of an old idea, but a profound repackaging of it, allowing people to hold onto a familiar comfort while accepting a new theological framework. The need for a vehicle to the divine remained, but the blueprint had changed. Even some of the grave goods found in later Christian burials hint at this subtle cultural lingering. While weapons and entire ships were no longer interred, it wasn't uncommon to find small, personal items that might have held a dual meaning. A simple iron knife buried with someone could be seen by a priest as a practical tool, but to the family, it might have whispered of an older tradition. The same could be said for a single bead, a comb, or even a coin placed in the grave. These objects could be justified within a Christian context as personal effects, or as the traditional payment for the ferrum in Charon, a concept borrowed from classical antiquity and grafted onto Christian practice. Yet, for a community still intimately connected to its recent pagan past, these items may have also served as a quiet, personal nod to the old ways, a final, hidden offering to ensure a safe passage, just in case the gods of their ancestors were still watching. This cultural ambiguity allowed people to navigate a dangerous period of change, publicly adhering to the new faith while privately honoring a deep-rooted heritage that had defined their world for centuries. The great ship burials may have sailed into history, but the currents of belief that powered them ran deep, flowing silently underground before resurfacing in the altered landscape of a new world. This quiet revolution in archaeology begins not with a shovel, but with a silent, invisible pulse of energy. For centuries, the only way to confirm a Viking ship burial was through the destructive, painstaking process of excavation, a gamble that risked destroying the very treasures it sought to uncover. But today, tools like ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and Ladby are acting like X-ray vision for archaeologists, allowing them to peer deep into the earth without ever breaking the soil. Ground-penetrating radar works by sending high-frequency radio waves into the ground and then reading the signals that bounce back. Different materials, soil, stone, wood, metal reflect these signals in unique ways. When researchers dragged a GPR unit over the field at Gokstad, the data that returned wasn't just random noise. It was the crisp, unmistakable ghost image of a Viking ship, its curving prow and stern perfectly defined, a 20-meter-long secret the Earth had kept for over a millennium. This was a watershed moment, proving that we could now discover these sites with pinpoint accuracy before a single grain of dirt is moved. Magnetometry offers another powerful lens, measuring tiny variations in the Earth's magnetic field. When soil is disturbed by digging a burial trench, for instance, or by the decomposition of organic material like a wooden ship, it creates a subtle magnetic anomaly. A hearth, a kiln, or even a pile of rusted iron rivets will also leave a distinct magnetic signature. By walking in a precise grid pattern with a magnetometer, archaeologists can map these invisible disturbances, effectively charting the ghostly footprints of human activity buried beneath their feet. This is how we can identify not just a ship, but the entire context around it. Post holes from feasting halls, cooking pits, and smaller graves, painting a complete picture of a Viking Age power center like the one emerging at Gokstad. LiDAR, or light detection and ranging, takes this view to a grand scale. Mounted on aircraft, it uses laser pulses to strip away modern vegetation, digitally revealing the contours of the ancient landscape beneath. This technology can expose the subtle bumps and depressions of long eroded burial mounds, forgotten fortifications, and ancient pathways, helping researchers identify promising sites for further investigation with GPR or magnetometry. Together, these tools form a non-invasive triad, a way to read the past like a book without having to tear out any pages. Yet this incredible power presents archaeologists with one of the most profound ethical dilemmas of our time. Now that we can locate these perfectly preserved time capsules with such precision, should we actually dig them up? The discovery of the Gokstad ship came with a heartbreaking caveat. Soil samples revealed that a highly aggressive fungus was actively consuming the ship's oak timbers. Left in the ground, it would have completely rotted away within a few decades. In this case, excavation was a rescue mission, a race against time to save the ship from total destruction. But what about a site that shows no immediate threat? The soil conditions in many parts of Scandinavia are exceptionally good at preserving organic material. Wood, leather, textiles, and even human hair can survive for over 1,000 years if they remain buried in wet, anaerobic clay, an environment devoid of oxygen that halts the decay process. The moment archaeologists expose these objects to air, the clock starts ticking. Immediate and incredibly expensive conservation is required to prevent them from shrinking, warping, or turning to dust. The Oseberg ship is a tragic example of this. After its near-perfect preservation for 11 centuries, its delicate wood began to deteriorate rapidly after excavation, and it now requires constant, meticulous care in a climate-controlled museum. This leads to a compelling argument for leaving well enough alone. By keeping a site buried, we effectively place it in a state of suspended animation, preserving it for future generations who will undoubtedly have technologies and techniques we can't even imagine. The tools we have today are revolutionary, but they are also undoubtedly primitive compared to what might be available in 50 or 100 years. Future archaeologists might have non-invasive methods that can not only map a site, but also analyze the molecular composition of artifacts, or even create three-dimensional digital reconstructions so perfect they eliminate the need for physical excavation altogether. Every time we dig, we are essentially destroying the site's context forever, even if we do it with the greatest care. We are making a choice for all of humanity, deciding that our curiosity and our current capabilities outweigh the potential for greater understanding in the future. The counter-argument, however, is equally powerful. Archaeology is not just about preserving objects, it's about recovering knowledge and sharing it with the world today. A buried ship is a secret, its stories and secrets locked away from public understanding and scientific study. The human remains inside can provide invaluable information about diet, disease, ancestry, and migration patterns through DNA and isotopic analysis. The grave goods can rewrite our understanding of trade networks, artistic styles, and cultural connections. Furthermore, the simple act of discovery has a profound impact, capturing the public's imagination and fueling a deeper appreciation for history. The Gokstad excavation, for instance, was streamed live online, allowing people from around the world to participate in the unveiling of history in real time, creating a global connection to the Viking Age that a raw data plot from a radar scan could never achieve. There is also the very real risk of leaving a site to be destroyed not by nature, but by humanity. Urban expansion, agricultural development, or the relentless threat of looters seeking a profit can destroy an unprotected site in a single day. Sometimes, the only way to save a piece of the past is to carefully, respectfully bring it into the light. This complex balancing act between preservation and knowledge, between the present and the future, is the defining challenge of modern archaeology, a mystery of ethics that we are only just beginning to navigate. From the moment that first farmers' spades struck the curved prow of the Gokstad ship, we have been utterly captivated. These magnificent burials are far more than just tombs. They are a stunning paradox, at once both grandiose public statements and incredibly intimate windows into the Norse soul. They show us a culture wrestling with the biggest questions of all: what awaits us after death, and how do we ensure our legacy once we are gone? The Viking answer was to build a vessel, a machine of both exploration and belief, and to load it with everything that defined a life: symbols of power, tools of trade, cherished heirlooms, and sometimes, tragically, the lives of those who served. Each discovery peels back another layer, but the core mystery only deepens. We see the political genius of the Balladoole chieftain, burying his ship atop a Celtic cemetery to claim a land. We feel the spiritual dread of the Ladby burial, where crushed animal skulls whisper of a terrifying final ceremony. And we are humbled by the quiet family story at Skar, where a Norse woman's Pictish brooches speak of cultural blending rather than simple conquest. These burials are frozen moments of supreme power, profound faith, and raw human emotion. They force us to abandon our simple stereotypes. This was not a world of mindless brutality, but one of sophisticated strategy, deep ritual, and a complex relationship with the unseen. The Viking path to the afterlife required a ship, whether built of oak, stone, or pure symbol. It was a journey that had to be prepared for with meticulous care, an investment in eternity that tells us they saw death not as an end, but as a voyage to another shore. So as our own exploration of these mysteries draws to a close, I'm left with two questions for you. Of all the enigmas we've sailed through, the identity of the Oseberg queen, the vanishing of the Ladby chieftain, the brutal end of the Salme warriors, or the hopeful journey of the Scar family, which one captivates your imagination the most? And if you could stand before a Viking chieftain at the prow of his buried ship, what single question would you ask him about his final voyage and the world he hoped to reach? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I truly love reading them. And if you enjoyed this journey into the depths of history, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell for more deep dives into the past.